Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 is a good game with a couple of flaws, and I want to talk about the game without spoiling the story for you. This video isn't sponsored, I wasn't given a review copy of the game, and at this point I've played plenty of the campaign, operations, and Eternal War. I personally believe that the most important thing in any video game is gameplay, and Space Marine 2's gameplay is really fun. The power fantasy of being a genetically enhanced space racist is captured really well in the game because it seamlessly blends action and third-person shooter mechanics. But everything that's good about Space Marine 2 starts to unravel when we get into its actual gameplay loop and content. For example, I love the fact that the campaign allows you to use basically everything that's in the game. This makes it a great tutorial for new players because it allows them to experiment with all the different weapons and mechanics. And it also makes it a great test for veteran players when they want to complete it on the hardest difficulty. Also, without getting into any spoilers, I thought that the story was really good. Don't get me wrong, this game isn't the Lord of the Rings by any means, but it focuses on the things that a 40k story about Space Marines should focus on. The story is about brotherhood, faith, and service to a greater cause, which is exactly what any 40k fan would expect and want from a game about Space Marines. We live in a time where developers make games like Forspoken or Dustborn, which have stories that are completely disconnected from anything and everything that gamers want. In Space Marine 2, the characters don't try to put themselves in their enemy's shoes or attempt to understand their perspective. The only solution to their problems is to kill everything. The biggest problems with the story are its extremely short length and lack of any impactful rewards. The campaign is about 6 to 10 hours long, depending on the player, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but it's definitely not a great thing either. Obviously, the developers could have inflated the length of the story by making you do things that didn't matter, but it looks like they wanted to keep it straight to the point, which is great, but my main issue with the campaign is that the developers didn't take any risks. The campaign doesn't shake gameplay up at all. For example, you never get to pilot any of the vehicles that Space Marines have access to, such as troop transports, tanks, or storm speeders, and you never get to do anything cool like put on a suit of Terminator armor. This really would have made for a welcome change of pace from the gameplay that is featured in the rest of the game. Additionally, even if you complete the campaign on the hardest difficulty, you don't get anything. You don't get an achievement, and you don't get any progression in operations or Eternal War. And that would have made a big difference because it takes forever to grind XP in both those game modes. Speaking of multiplayer, let's talk about Operations and Eternal War, the game's co-op PvE and competitive PvP modes respectively. Operations are really fun, but they're also very flawed. In this game mode, you get to choose from one of 6 classes, and these classes dictate everything from weapon choice to your perks to your ability. Not gonna lie, progressing classes by leveling them up and upgrading weapons feels really satisfying. You definitely notice a massive power spike whenever you get to that next weapon tier or get that godlike perk that shakes up your gameplay. There's also very clear visible progression. You'll know exactly how much a person plays the game just by looking at their Space Marine, which I really enjoy. This packaged with Space Marine 2's great combat is a recipe for success on the surface, but when you dive in, you'll notice a couple of problems. The first problem you're going to run into is that there are only 6 missions, and it's going to take most players at least 20 hours to get each class to max level. If you're running with a great team, this leveling process can be cut down to just 3 hours per class by speedrunning the Vox Liberatus mission, which takes about 10 minutes to complete per run on Ruthless difficulty. Additionally, even if a player gets to max level, their progression might be halted because they didn't find servo skulls in the various levels that they completed, and so their weapons aren't upgraded. You can also get armory data by killing Terminus level enemies or the bosses in the game, but those are randomly spawned on you, so they're not really guaranteed. In a 40k game, you would expect that the most efficient way to progress would be to kill things, but that's just not the case here. Because you don't get armory data from killing anything other than bosses, there are going to be a lot of people who try to speedrun their way through missions. And this is the perfect example of how developers shape gameplay, diminishing the experience of something that should be really good. If the developers released an update tomorrow that tied XP, mastery, and armory data to kills, then everybody would start full clearing maps. Additionally, operations can get really intense, so your build needs to be on point in order to be able to deal with getting swarmed by a horde, a patrol of Majoris enemies, and a boss all at the same time. And because of this, weapon balance and class balance is a massive issue. People have already discovered that the Meltagun is absolutely insanely overpowered hard, and the entire assault class is absolutely insanely underpowered. When it comes to weapon balancing, I'm not sure why, but Warhammer 40k game developers are always afraid of making the bolter one of the best weapons in the game when it really deserves to be one of the best. That being said, I'm okay with some weapons being inferior in operations if they actually have a use in Eternal War or the game's PvP. Just like Space Marine 2's other game modes, PvP is also really fun. My favorite thing about it is that it seems like there's kind of a counter to everything, which can make teamfights a little more engaging than other third-person shooters. But just because certain classes hard counter specific playstyles or weapon choices doesn't mean the potential to outplay your opponent doesn't exist. You can still finesse people, and it feels good beating the class that is supposed to counter yours. Eternal War is basically an entirely different game compared to Operations, which is nearly an entirely different game when compared to the campaign. For example, armor regenerates really fast when compared to Operations, and even your health will regenerate if you're out of combat for long enough. Additionally, the time to kill values on other players is way quicker than killing enemies in co-op missions. The various types of bolters are really good, since headshots are important when you're trying to achieve the fastest time to kill possible, and melee weapons damage health straight through armor, so they actually have a place in PvP too. All of these factors make PvP pretty damn good, but just like the other two game modes in Space Marine 2, it has some major flaws. Just like in Operations, you have to level up in Eternal War, and what you get is the ability to use the weapons that you've already been using in Operations and the story. I would have preferred if they took a lot of the really cool looking cosmetic rewards you get from completing Operations and Eternal War and separated them into long-term chase items that allow you to show off your mastery of each game mode. Another thing that really sucks about PvP is that there are only 3 game modes and 3 maps. Are you seeing the trend here? Space Marine 2 gave us 3 high-quality experiences in its campaign, Operations, and Eternal War, but there's a severe lack of quantity in its content right now. Fortunately, the game is a live service powered by seasonal passes, so you shouldn't have to spend any more money beyond your original purchase to benefit from content added later on, unless you want specific cosmetics. As a Warhammer 40k Andy, I'd give Space Marine 2 a good old IGN 7 out of 10, with the possibility of it becoming much better over time as we get more content. I'm excited for lethal difficulty in Season 2, the Horde mode that's being added in Season 4, more weapons, more missions, prestige ranks in PvE, and more PvP maps. If you're someone who's interested in a casual experience, I'd recommend grabbing Space Marine 2 whenever it goes on sale in the future. But if you're a sicko like me, and you actually like grinding, go ahead and pick the game up. You'll love the combat, you'll love the progression, and you'll love the setting. Anyways, if you've stuck around for this long, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you love Warhammer video games. This has been Jeficus, and I'll see you in-game.